Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one there are several Russian advances in the Pokrovsk direction, in the northern and southern flanks of Kurakhove, and in the Remevsky Lech direction. Other than that, there are some developments in terms of information we have available with regards to the power balance in Ukraine, and some additional comments on the situation in the Kursk region and throughout the front line in general. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to close the pocket of Makarivka and gain full control over the settlement following the flanking maneuvers, cutting off and encircling the Ukrainian forces in this direction. The Russians have now successfully pushed up along the cut-off areas where they have moved along the encircled path towards Storoshevo, but they'll likely do a strong push from the western flank following the capture of the majority of the fortified positions in the area to then gain control over Storoshevo as well, which is already in a semi-encirclement or operational encirclement, following which the fighting will be focused around the fortified positions of the Ukrainians west of Remivka along the main road, in the direction of Niskushne, which will put the front line at the village agglomeration of Velika Novosilka and the surrounding settlements, and then the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of these settlements. The Russians pulled off a well-executed encirclement of the settlement of Makarivka, and following that, additional semi-encirclement of Storoshevo, which has limited the Russian casualties in these operations and increased the Ukrainian casualties in these operations. The Russians previously attempted to gain a foothold within Makarivka, which they succeeded with doing, but the Russians were then pushed out by a Ukrainian counterattack, showing that the Ukrainians had a strong presence within the settlement, and with the fortified positions in the northern parts of it, they were able to take advantage of the holdings within the settlements to push back Russian forces that attempted to gain control over the settlement. The settlement itself is very narrow, it's not a wide one, which means that Russian forces within the settlement would also be exposed. Following the capture of Blahodatna in the northeastern flank, as well as the fortified positions in the western flank, the Russians then had control of the high ground northwest of Makarivka, control over the eastern bank of the river line, and through a river crossing maneuver, they managed to completely cut off this connection between Makarivka and Storoshevo, pushing away any ability of the Ukrainians to counterattack or establish defensive positions within it, which allowed for a quick and easy takeover by Russian forces. As for the fate of the Ukrainian forces, according to Syriac maps, they managed to withdraw from the settlements. According to pretty much every other source, they did not. So it is unclear exactly what happened, but we can assume they likely withdrew under heavy fire by the Russians on both flanks. Moving on to the southern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the southern bank of the river line all the way up to Selenivka, where fighting is taking place on the southern outskirts of the settlement. The Russians are moving towards Konstantinopel and to Ruslev from the eastern and southern direction, where they're moving up along the fields, gaining control over those. Due to the lack of Ukrainian fortified positions, the Russian advances here is on a regular basis and moving fairly smoothly, with hardly that many fights taking place over these settlements. This leads to the roads towards Konstantinopel and Ruslev being fairly empty. The Russians have to deal with the drones of the Ukrainian forces, their artillery, and their minefields. However, with the new strategy that the Russians have used in Novye Kumar, they are able to deal with all of these challenges. They are dropping off infantry in one first line after another to prevent any Ukrainian counterattack from pushing them back significantly from these settlements once they reach them. So the Russians are simply moving in a slow, steady, and secure way where they're not putting out a lot of risk. If they simply went to these settlements, the Ukrainians could counterattack and wipe out their forces. But now that they're moving slowly, dropping up infantry at any defensive position they can establish, they're able to prevent any strong Ukrainian counterattack from appearing at a quick pace. They would rather have to build up forces and take more time to do so. And when you build up forces, they are exposed to reconnaissance, artillery, MLR strikes, and so on. And therefore, the Russians are looking to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to build up their forces, or if they attempt to do so, they would likely take a lot of losses. Therefore, the Russians are moving very safely but also smartly towards these settlements. Gaining control over Constantinople will allow the Russians to cut off this single supply road in and out of Kurakhove, which remains, and allow the Russians to encircle all Ukrainian forces within this entire massive pocket around Kurakhove. At the same time, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Constantinople and he hands here to the southern bank of the Sukhayeli River. This prevents the Ukrainians from making any significant counterattacks in the southern bank of the river, as they would have to do a river crossing, and it will also allow the Russians to concentrate their forces in the northern bank of the river line to push alongside it, but from the northern side to gain control over Yantarne and the settlements across, to then flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Kurakhove and move upwards towards Ulekli along the river line, or to move towards Delny and Kurakhove from the northern direction to gain control over the settlement through a concentration of forces within the city itself. Therefore, a lot of options are opening up for the Russians to concentrate their forces either on the northern bank of the river line or alongside the river line to the south to launch further offensive operations towards the western border area between Donetsk and Dnipro. At the same time, the main focus is around the remaining supply lines in and out of Kurakhove. In the northern direction, the Russians have captured west of Sonsivka some forest patches and forest lines in an attempt to push towards Petropavlivka. The Russians are already fighting at the outskirts of Shevchenko, and they are also fighting on the outskirts of Slovianka. With this, the Russians are now attacking all three settlements in the northern flank of Kurakhove, of Shevchenko, Petropavlivka, and Slovianka. The Russians are also started fighting around Ukrainka, Novolenivka, and the settlement of Novovasilivka here in the western direction from the Pokrovsk section of the front line. The Russian objective is to launch a general offensive all across the front line here in the western part towards the Dnipro region, to reach the Dnipro region from the southwest of Pokrovsk and all the way down south to the Zaporizhia region as well, to gain full control over this entire area. To do so, they're launching offensive operations in the northern parts and all throughout it along the northern flank of Kurakhove, while at the same time looking to flank the remaining supply lines in and out of Kurakhove, encircling the Ukrainian forces within the city and the surrounding areas, to then push along the fortified positions towards the border area, and finally towards the northern parts of Velika Novosilica, cutting off supplies to that settlement, and then pushing upwards towards the border area to the northwestern direction. So generally, offensive operations all across to, at the minimum, cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and the southern parts of the Donetsk region, which has already been cut off through the main highway, but also the next highways here west of Pokrovsk, and at the same time to move towards the border area and gain full control over the southern Donetsk region. The Russians have also advanced south of Pokrovsk along the first line of defense, where they are moving to gain control over Dashenske, moving in the eastern and western directions towards Selene, and to gain control of the remaining parts of Dashenske. This is to gain control of the southern bank of the river line, which moves through the center of Lysivka, through the entire settlement of Dashenske, and separating Selene from Dashenske and Vitroshenya. The Russians are looking to gain control over the southern bank of the river line to then move onwards to the northern bank through a flanking maneuver from Shevchenko. The Russians also attacked north of Shevchenko, as we see with this geolocated footage, fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of the settlement and moving towards Peshane from the southern and western directions. The Russians are continuing offensive operations to gain control over the settlements and supply lines west of Pokrovsk, separating the Donetsk region from the Dnipro and Zaporizhia regions. In the direction of the Kursk region, the Ukrainians are fighting with the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is also making use of the Abrams tanks. With regards to that, there is this footage of a destroyed Abrams tanks, which was abandoned. We see that there is the cages built on top of the Abrams tanks to deal with the drones. But when we compare this to the turtle tank, especially the modernized turtle tank, we see that the turtle tank is very effective in dealing with the offensive operations that they have to commit to protect the convoy of vehicles that it is driving through. If the Ukrainians had a similar turtle tank, either of the Abrams use or any other vehicle, they can launch similar offensive operations If the Ukrainians at the start of the Kursk offensive had a similar turtle tank, they would be able to go much deeper and much more successful. The fact that the Ukrainians still have not adapted to the turtle tank, which the Russians have now been using for over half a year, it really shows how slow they are to adapt to these innovative designs. Whether it's because they look stupid or whatever the reason is, the fact that they're not adapting to something that is as useful as a turtle tank after this long really shows that they are not in a position where they can win this war, not just because of lack of manpower, not because of lack of equipment and so on, but because of lack of adaptation, which is the most important thing. When fighting modern war, you need to be adaptable, you need to adapt to the ever-evolving technological advancements that take place. Whether it looks stupid, it always does so when you're making it on the move. The Russian turtle tank looked extremely stupid at the start, but it was effective, and now it is much more effective and looks way less stupid. And that is exactly how you adapt. You make something that works, and when it works, you adapt it, you improve it, and you continue using it at a large scale. Now the Russians are successfully taking settlement after settlement with the use of these turtle tanks, and the Ukrainians are refusing to make a single one of them. As we can see here, this Forbes article from June 26th of 2024, Russian turtle tanks are blind, loud, and stupid, yet they're the ones that gives the Russians the success they need to gain control over the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.